Yes, hottest day of the year, hottest day in 70 years. And we've come to indulge in professional development. It makes you question some of your life choices, doesn't it? Well, this is, as those of you who got releases and things will know, a bit of a last-minute substitution. That's my excuse. Maggie, who is going to be talking, is unable to, and will, I'm sure, do it at a later date, and it will be well worth coming to hear. On the other hand, you got me. What I'm going to be talking about, because that was what I thought about doing at short notice, was, well, I've called it welcoming learners' own languages into the ELT classroom. It's been a bit of a bee in my bonnet for quite some time. And thankfully, it's something that is beginning, I think, to gain some traction in ELT generally. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this kind of thing. And of course, inevitably. It's all over the place. It's all over the place in ELT. It's all over the place in English language teaching. Speak to any of your marketing people, and I don't care how righteous you personally are, your marketing people will probably be banging on about how it's only English in the classrooms in our school. Oh, yeah. It's not a new idea, particularly. This gentleman with the impressive beak is John Locke. Who said people are accustomed to the right way of teaching language, which is by talking it into children in constant conversation and not by grammatical rules. This was in 1690 something. Back as far as the 16th century, certainly, ideas of kind of natural teaching of languages, natural learning of languages, not to be confused with Krashen and Tyrrell, were common. In particular, they became hugely significant in the latter part of the 19th century. Sorry, I'm doing a little excursion into history because I like that. Because, sort of, frankly, translation had got something of a bad rap. What was known as grammar translation developed, or in America, I think it's still called the Prussian method. Developed out of sort of Latin and Greek teaching, which involved the translation of example sentences into and out of the target language, sentences invented in order to best exemplify the grammatical principles, and leading to things like the cat of my aunt is more treacherous than the dog of your uncle, which I have Google translated. So if any of those are wrong, it's not my fault. Translation, I suppose, actually, before we go on to the gentleman with the impressive mustachios, by the 1890s, people like Henry Sweet, Ludwig Virchow, Henry Passy founded the International Phonetic Association in 1898. And they advocated a form of language teaching which largely involved conveying and making meanings within the target language. They were a bit cooler than many of us today because they were quite happy to use the first language to explain complex little things and just get over some of the bumps in the road. However, and we get on to Maximilian Berlitz. Before him, Sauveur, people like that, were developing what later became known as direct methods, which you'll still see, you know, the Berlitz schools, there's Callan schools, there are in linguas all over the place. Direct methods developed in the 1890s, and that is a moustache to die for, isn't it, really? Look at that. Were setting precepts, and they had a massive advantage. They were competing really against school language teaching, which was all this translate in and out. The cat of my aunt is more treacherous than the dog of your uncle. My sons have bought the mirrors of the Duke, or as Henry Sweet famously remembered, the philosopher pulled the lower jaw of the hen. These people were setting up private language schools, and guess what? It was a marketing gimmick. They set up a thing, and their thing was, this was kind of, well, here are some precepts. These are Maximilian Berlitz. I think it was Maximilian Delphinius Berlitz. It's even better. These are some of the precepts that are still, I mean, basically followed at Berlitz schools today. And look, first one, never translate, demonstrate. We're not translating. We're using language. We're not making speeches. We're asking questions. We're trying to develop communication. We're not speaking single words. We're using full bits of language. We don't speak too much. We don't have TTT. Oh, no, no, no. We have STT. 1890s, remember. Actually, 1860s, I think this was. I like Take It Easy. It's quite good. And these were very successful. They competed very successfully against school language programs and continue to compete to this day. So it's not really a new idea. A little bit of terminology before we get going. Starting with a question. Why ban the use of learners L1 in class? We are all English language teachers in this room, so I'm sure we're all thoroughly familiar with L1. Oh yes. But it's, I suppose it's a term of art, isn't it? So perhaps we could talk about their first language. Of course, it might not be their first language. Perhaps we could talk about their mother tongue. But even that, in many learners, in many cases, in many contexts, they're not single linguistic individuals in the first place. They don't necessarily have a mother tongue. They may have mother tongues. There was a student actually here. He was a student a long, long time ago, 15, maybe even 20 years ago, who started in an FCE class and actually ended up going to do a PhD in applied linguistics, which is quite a journey. And his PhD thesis was about trilingualism, and he was interviewing people who'd grown up speaking 3 languages. And there was a lot of stuff. I loved his questionnaires. It was kind of, what language do you swear in? What language do you try to seduce people in? It was kind of good stuff. So maybe mother tongue isn't a good one. Learners' own language is one that has become the kind of default correct. Probably after Philip Kerr particularly, but also Graham Hall and Guy Cook. Also, who else? I suppose Sheila Dalla and Mariam Volokri as well. The term the learner's own language is substituted. I have to say, I'll use them pretty much interchangeably. I don't much care. Yes, we perhaps do need to remember some of these things, but L1, mother tongue, first language, own language, let's just stick with it. Okay, why would we want... Banning a language is quite a big deal, let's face it. Irish language was banned in Ireland under British rule. That went well. The Catalan language was banned under Franco's rule in Spain, and we all know how much the Catalans love their cousins in Madrid. So banning a language is actually quite a big deal, I would argue. So we need, if we were going to do something that dramatic, we kind of need a reason for it. And there are different language contexts and there are different teaching contexts. So can I just take a quick straw poll? How many people here teach monolingual groups with whom they share a language? 1, 2. How many people here teach monolingual groups that they don't share a language with? 2, 3. and possibly some of the others. I mean, I do from time to time. How many people here teach multilingual groups that they obviously don't share everybody's language? The vast majority. Okay, that was kind of what I was expecting, and that's kind of where the focus will be. We will try to talk about some of the others. But I'd like you to I'm going to force you to do a little bit of, well, not force you. I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of pair work. I don't do this lightly. I can't bear it myself. With some friends of mine at conferences, I've long harbored the desire to produce a range of T-shirts that just say, "Don't try to TEFL me." Because frankly, if I'm at something like this, I just want to sit in the back and kind of perhaps have a think about it, perhaps drift off for a while. I don't come here to talk to somebody I've never met. If you're like me, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Don't feel bad. If, on the other hand, you're the conversational type, feel free. Can you I'll just literally 30 seconds a minute, what reasons might we have for banning the use of learners' own languages in the class in monolingual settings and in multilingual settings? Minute maximum. Go for it. Okay, can I call a halt? Call a halt there. This is one of the reasons I can't stand PowerPoint in classes generally, because obviously I've got my answers that I've written here. If I was using a whiteboard, I could call things out and I could write them and say, yeah, that's brilliant. As it is, I've got the brilliant ones, obviously, and you can either fail or get them. There's only a certain number of ways to handle it. So I'll tell you what I thought, or some obvious things, and they are bloody obvious things, that I thought. And if you have anything to add, perhaps I'll give you the opportunity. I think in monolingual settings, one of the obvious ones is the classroom is the learner's only opportunity to speak. If you are teaching in an FL environment, if you're teaching in a context in which English is not a significant language outside the classroom, your learners perhaps have 4.5 hours a week in which to use English. It's not unreasonable to say during that 4.5 hours a week, they should be using as much English as they can. I'd still perhaps dial back a little bit from an absolute ban, but I can certainly see the point. It's a relevant point. Even, I think it's fair to say, monolingual groups coming and travelling to the UK, if we get a group of 17-year-olds coming to stay here in London and do language courses, their experience is pretty much entirely mediated through their first language. They don't spend a lot of time chatting with folk on the street. The language class is still the time they're going to produce. A lot of people would say that allowing the first language is a bit of a slippery slope. You let them start talking their first language, and before you know it, you've lost them. I don't think that's true, but there we go. This is a truth, but not necessarily a pleasant one. Learners themselves or their parents, their schools, their whatever, expect it. And if you don't deliver, well, you don't keep your job, do you? And finally, learners need to think in English. We'll return to that. Multilingual settings, it's rude. If you're using your first language, you're kind of excluding the other people in the classroom. It could be seen as unfair, particularly if the teacher shares a language with some of the class. I speak a little bit of Spanish, I speak a little bit of French. In my classrooms, I can help a Spanish-speaking learner sometimes with a bit of vocabulary or something. Whereas the poor Japanese person has to listen to my pathetic string of supposedly well-formed eliciting questions instead of just getting a nice, quick answer. Learners travel and pay a lot for immersion courses. They don't expect to be using their native language. Learners and other stakeholders expect it, and again, learners need to think in English. This is something that really, the first time somebody said that to me, they need to think in English, I thought, do I think in English? I don't know. I don't really think very much about the language that I think in most of the time. Metacognition is way beyond me. Think in English. And just to sort of cheer me up a little bit, there was a study, and I can't for the life of me remember who did it. There was a study in, I think, about 2009 that suggested the idea of thinking in English was a ludicrous one, below, well, certainly B2, but really, frankly, going on to C1. Really, truly thinking in the second language, lower than that, is just, you're kidding yourself. So, how many people in this room have an official or an institutional L1 ban or English-only policy, even where you work? How many people have one? Not too many. Interestingly enough, none of the OHC people have, and if you speak to our marketing department, you'll find that we do. Though they're the only people who know about it. Anybody here who has a personal, like a sort of classroom ban? I don't allow other languages in my classroom. 1, 2, 3, 4, a few, yeah. Okay. How effective is it?
It depends on the level of the student and the classroom routines.
Mm-hmm.
They lose lives in my classroom.
They lose lives. I like that. Sorry.
I think it's a level thing. I think the more advanced either work is paying for it or they're paying for it out of their own pocket. They want that immersion, as you say. I think
it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that you say that. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that particularly, I think certainly people I've known, and it's possible some of the people there who put their hands up, would say that at higher levels it's more reasonable to expect English only. I think your point is a very good one. They are kind of driving for it, and they can actually do it at that level.
I do allow them to count in their own language, though, because that just comes naturally. They always count.
I think that is a brilliant one, actually. I like that. Yeah.
It just doesn't matter how advanced they are. They always count in their first language.
Yeah, especially in the realm of money.
Yes.
Yeah. So can we have a moment of honesty? I think many of us would possibly claim or say that we try to get our learners to speak English as much as possible. We would probably try to say we have quite an English-heavy classroom. And again, just a minute or less. When, if ever, do you ever use learners' own language in the classroom, and why? Just 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Okay, can I stop you there? Marry a hand. Pardon? I know, it's dreadful. Hello. Sorry, call you to order. Suggestions. Do you use... who here does occasionally use learner's first language in the classroom? Oh, a lot of people. So what sort of time?
If I've had students who have had an epileptic fit, to get them back quicker into their surroundings.
That is a very interesting one. A rarity, I hope. Yeah, no, a rarity, I hope, but it may relate to something we'll talk about a bit later. Any others?
Just to say correction. If I notice the first language influence, so I've taught some Spanish students, and comparatives, they always use more. So I'll say it's mass, it's because you're thinking of that.
Yeah.
Just for correction.
Okay. Any other?
Qualifications and time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, just something similar to what you said. Just if it saves time, if it's just a lot quicker, the student is persisting.
Yeah, just get it out of the way. Okay. And while we're in the same spirit of honesty, and again, a little bit of pair work, when do learners use their own languages, whether you ban it or not, in the classroom? And again, why? Just a couple of minutes again. While you do that, I'm going to go and get a top up. Okay, once again, if I can pull you back. Can we have some suggestions? When do learners use their own language and why?
To help each other, to double check if understood.
Okay, any others?
The situation when I would ban is for teens when they use this for social communication, for showing off when they're in a monolingual environment, and that I would stop because they need to learn to do the same in English.
Okay.
But they tend to do it when they get excited or they've got something that they really want to say.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And
I find an excitement often like idiomatic languages, language where they kind of realise and then they can tell each other, and it's got quite a fun kind of link that they make.
Yeah.
That's for excitement.
Sometimes when they're sort of thinking in their first language, and then that spills over into spoken.
Okay.
Without realising.
Yeah, I mean we're into Vygotsky territory here, aren't we? Thought and language. I'm guessing that comparatively few of you during that little bit of pair work, tell me if I'm wrong, said, for badness. Just because they're little bastards who don't want to learn anything. I'm guessing you didn't say that, which I think is revealing because by and large my students are not. And I don't think for the most part when they start using their first language, it's like, my wife was a primary teacher and then she taught for a long time in an exclusion unit, which is real teaching, where you've got kids sort of doing the wall of death on an average day. And yeah, there are kids who are just being bad, they're just out of control. Most of my students, they're lovely. They're not really being bad. They just, they get overexcited, or they're showing off a bit, or they're trying to they're even trying to help each other. I don't think any of those are such terrible things. And I think there are potential negative consequences to a ban. I think one of them is a matter of learner identity. I can't remember who it was who wrote it, and I haven't been able to find the quote, but somebody once said that your first language names the world in a way that no other language ever will. It's your anchor, it's your thing, it's who you are. Your language, whether it's your first language or your suite of languages that you grew up with, those are who you are. This thing you're doing as you get a bit older is a different thing. And I have a personal thing with that. I don't know about you. I have a lot of students who will tell me you'll get the student, you say, what's your name? And they'll say, it's Krzysztof, but you can call me Chris. And let me try. I find it difficult to say Krzysztof. It dislocates my jaw. I don't find it easy, but damn it, I want to try. And I want to try to pronounce the Chinese student's name and the whatever. I want to try to pronounce them if I can. And I have a personal, slightly, probably I'm revealing too much here, but when I was learning French in my secondary school, my middle school, my teacher obviously had, I guess she'd been reading Suggestipedia or something. She decided we all had to have French names, which was fine, you know. If you're John, you become Jean, and if you're David, you become David. If you're Claire, you stay Claire. If you're Elizabeth, you become Elizabeth. It's not a problem. I'm Howard. So he got around to me and it was Howard. Okay, you can be Pierre. Pierre? And who's Pierre? I'm not Pierre. I don't want to be Pierre. I have no interest in Pierre. Now, as it happened, I quite liked my French lessons, but that's a robbery of my identity. It was brutal. Genuinely, I was unhappy having my teacher, somebody I rather liked, say, "Et Pierre?" I didn't like that. That's not me. Me is a thing, and it's supposed to be important in the classroom. And your first language, your mother tongue, your language is an important thing for you. And I would say that is even more important when you're dealing with teenagers, when you're dealing with perhaps less confident individuals. Phillipson, linguistic imperialism. I think there are times, and in most of our contexts I suspect it's not true, but I think there are times when we don't want to hear your language here can appear to devalue or disregard the learner's own cultural identity, particularly if that cultural identity is slightly fragile. If you're dealing with an English person and you're trying to teach them French or German or something, you'll probably have them at the back going, their cultural identity is pretty secure. If you're dealing with somebody who is in their 50s, 60s maybe, and is a native Catalan speaker, no Catalan here, they remember that. That's not a nice feeling for them. And there is a danger again in some cultures where English is seen as a kind of an invader language. A language which will come and it'll seed itself in your community and it'll kill the local language. And I don't think that's an unreasonable fear. It can look like what's usually described as subtractive bilingualism. Learning another language and effectively losing the language you had. More practically speaking, it's a waste of bloody time. I mean, Oliver, you said it, you know, there are times when just a translation is so much easier. Especially if you're talking about, you know, very clearly lexical words. I remember once seeing a CELTA trainee trying to draw a picture of a badger on the board to explain what a badger was. Oh my God, it must have been about 15 minutes of trying to, no, it's not a skunk, no, it's bigger than that, no, not a dog, no, sort of black and white, and it, oh, for God's sake, it's a badger. If you could just give them the word badger, life would be so much simpler. There are potentially unintended consequences. Interestingly enough, and there have been studies to demonstrate that, I can't cite any of them off the top of my head, I'm afraid, although there are a couple of references at the end of this talk where you'll find references to this kind of stuff. There is evidence, and I think Philip Kerr mentions it, that reducing own language use can actually end up reducing overall language use. In effect, and it's not completely unreasonable. I stop you speaking your native language and you're sort of halted in production in general. You become much more cautious about producing because you're very aware that your production is a kind of a value, it's a thing that is being, it's not just you erupting with meaning. It's bloody frustrating. Personally speaking, I remember as a learner of Spanish, I like to think of myself as a halfway bright person who's got some opinions on things that are worth hearing. And you get your teacher and they give you this really interesting thing to talk about. This is going back a hell of a long way, 20 odd years in the centre of London. And there was a woman I knew vaguely, she taught somewhere else, I can't remember. And she, like me, was a literature graduate. And we were literature graduates in the early middle 80s, which will give you an idea of the kind of literature we thought was a good idea. And I talked to her and I was saying, how's the class going? She says, oh, well, it's really weird. And I said, why? And she said, you will never guess who I've got in my beginners class. It's Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You are kidding. No, seriously, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I said, my God, that is incredible. And she said, no, it's awful. I don't speak a word of Spanish, and it's a really low-level English class. The only conversation we can have is, so Gabriel, what did you have for breakfast? I had bread and jam. And it's kind of, I want to talk about art and beauty and life and love and death, and I don't want to talk about bread and jam. I don't care what he had for breakfast. And more seriously, on a personal level, how many times have you set learners a task and you've got somebody who you know has got something they're bursting to say, but they just don't have the English for it, and that is amazingly frustrating for them. And that is going to be demotivating. So I'm sorry to co-opt a trope which has been adapted by the far right, but what the hell. We can take the blue pill and we can all go back to our no first language in this class. Or we can take the red pill and we can see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Using your own language and other languages together is natural and spontaneous. It builds new language knowledge on the foundations of your own language knowledge. And quite frankly, it is inevitable. It is going to happen. If you tell me your learners do not translate, what do they do then? I tell you they do, they translate. Henry Widdowson, in Defining Issues in English Language Teaching, wrote, while the learners in their own minds keep the two languages in contact, teachers in the classroom try to keep them separate. There's a lot of research which is about the idea that in fact, languages aren't kept separate anyway. They intermingle and they touch and they co-relate. To maintain the metaphor. Mainstream ELT, there's been a kind of an abomination of explicitly using the first languages. It's something that is a bit of an embarrassment. Very often at Oxford House, we have courses for non-native overseas teachers of English. And the number of times over the last 10, 15 years I've said, so do you translate in your classes? Do you use your first language? And they say, well, yeah, but not if my my boss is around. And in fact, Graham Hall reported a teacher trainer in part of his survey data. He reported a teacher trainer saying, all my TESOL students know that if they ever utter one word of their own language in the classroom, I will burst into their classroom and strangle them in front of their students. It's fairly intemperate language there, should we say. So why might, or perhaps should, and I'm kind of racing a bit because I'd like to get to a few, we're not going to be able to do demonstrations, but I'd like to get to a few practical suggestions if we could. The main reason is this reflects the way people use language. I'm going to reiterate that point. Bilingual language users routinely mix languages, switch from one language to another, code switch. The trendy word these days is translanguaging. But it's what anybody who is competent in more than one language does. They do it all the time, especially if they're talking to other people who are competent in the same range of languages. They flip between them and twist around them, and that's how people use language. It is utterly unnatural for anybody who is not a sort of gammon-faced English loon who only speaks one language anyway, and therefore, finds it insane to bring a second language into the party. Most people in the world speak 2 or more languages, and they use them with fluency and facility and mixture. It reflects real-world language because most learners in your classes will be using English in a polylingual context. The number of your learners who will go out into the world and find themselves in an English-only context, 0% or thereabouts. They will be going out into a world in which people speak multiple languages, and they speak multiple languages, and their use of those multiple languages is the skill that they have. Something I've said to my own kids who are diabolical at languages. My boys, they're all at university now, they're too old to be changed, but my oldest boy could possibly tell you how old he is in French. That's about as far as it would go. No, he probably couldn't, because I don't think he knows the numbers past 20. He could do it when he was still a teenager. And people say, oh, well, yeah, but he doesn't need to learn another language, does he, because he's English? Yeah, well, all the other kids, they speak English now. And they speak another language, and possibly another one on top of that, and possibly another one on top of that. And those are the people that my son is going to be competing for jobs with. Multiple language use and polylanguage use is the norm. Direct translation, and yes, translation is one of those words that sometimes it kind of gets a bad press because you start to think about the idea of it's a transliteration almost. Or you think of the idea of interpreting, of something, of a kind of an exact transmission of what was said. Mediation, on the other hand, is hugely common. By mediation, what I mean is, and I would argue that most of your learners, when they use English, will use English to mediate. They will use English because they will be the person who speaks English and their own language in a context in which there is somebody who speaks only English and somebody who only speaks their own language. And their job will be to mediate between those two people. Not to translate, not to be kind of like in the UN conducting delicate negotiations, but they maybe got a job in a beach cafe and they have to take the order of the, for some reason I think he looks Scottish, customer who speaks only English and is trying to get an egg bap. And they're going to have to take that back to the chef who speaks only Italian and try to explain what the hell the customer wants. They're not going to be translating. What they're going to be doing is trying to help these two languages coexist. Or perhaps if they're slightly more high-flying, they will be sent by their boss to an international conference where they meet people in their business sector from around the world, and they talk to them, and they have meetings, and they have important power breakfasts, and they go for jogs and things like that. And then they have to go back to their boss, who is much too rich to speak another language. And they will have to explain to their boss what it is happened at this conference, what was said. Those are the things they will really have to do in English, really, truly, honestly, importantly have to do in English. And that is fundamental. Moving, switching between those two languages, making those two languages work together is what they need. Anyway, their first language use is going to happen whether we like it or not. I don't care whether you have a ban. I don't care whether your school has a... They are going to use their first language. They are going to translate. If you ban them vocalizing their first language, they will sub-vocalize it. It's going to happen. And the question is it going to happen without our control at all? Is it just going to be something that goes on in the classroom like air conditioning? Or is it something we're going to try to bring into our pedagogical world? Is it something we're going to try to think about and think, how can we use this sensibly and valuably? How can we gain from this rather than just letting it happen on a mild bubble underneath us and pretend it doesn't exist when the boss walks in? Can we use it to our advantage? Can we use it to the learner's advantage? Or at the very least, if there is a problem using first language, can we mitigate some of the problems? Okay, I think there are some possible, and again, Philip Kerr sets out some possible pedagogical functions. These are not suggestions, they're just areas we might like to think about when we are planning a principled introduction of first language or own language. There are what he calls medium-oriented goals. That is, it can be helpful to explain vocabulary. It can be useful for explicit grammar teaching. I think most people are agreed, since Norris and Ortega, most people are agreed that explicit grammar teaching is a thing and a good thing. A lot of people, particularly in the task-based learning tradition, don't really hold with it as much of an acquisition driver. And if it's not really driving acquisition, you might as well do it in the first language, if that helps, if that's easier. What he calls framework-oriented goals, which actually subsumes the second one in Kerr's book, but giving instructions, setting homework, making arrangements, when's the summer holiday? When do you have to be back after the long weekend? These kind of practical things that happen. It can be easier or clearer to do them in the first language. I'm not convinced about giving instructions on a personal level. Giving instructions is one that I think is giving instructions, teacher giving instructions, that is, I think is something probably that is best done in English. Largely because it's one of the very few genuinely communicative opportunities we have in the language classroom. The rest of them are all, to some extent, faked, if you like. There are social goals as well, and this goes back to your idea with the person who had epilepsy. Just are you all right? Showing concern, showing interest. Building up. One of our teachers in one of our schools in the UK has a habit of kind of just when a new student comes in, he prides himself on having kind of just a few words in most of the learner's language and just sort of saying hello or welcome or whatever it is in the native language. It's nice. They like it. Building relationships within the class. Here are some things that learners might do in class, and I'm conscious of time going on, but I can't see. He's not here yet, so I'll keep going for a little while, but I won't keep you too much longer. Here are some things learners might well do. Actually, we'll just go through rather than discuss. They might use bilingual dictionaries, word lists, look on their phone, translate words. They might compare English grammar with the grammar of their first language. That can be very, very useful. I remember with one class, one of the first classes, when I first discovered that subject questions existed. Streamlined departures, I want you, Fiona. I want you, Fiona, I need you, Fiona, I love you. Absolutely. I want you, Fiona. Subject questions. And suddenly as an English speaker, I thought, Christ, there are 2 ways we ask questions. I'd never noticed that. And I was trying to teach the damn thing. And in the end, I realized that the easiest way to do it was to get everybody in the class up to write on the board how they did the who loves Fiona, who does Fiona love on the board. And then get everybody to come up and in languages that were not their own to try to circle the things that made the difference between the 2 questions. And you could do it. You could do it in Japanese. You could see the little marker that changed it. And you had all these students going, oh. In exactly the same way I did when I read the teacher's book. I thought, oh, bloody hell, yeah, we do that, don't we? I'd never thought about that. They haven't either. They do it, they've just never thought about it. Watch TV and video with English language subtitles. We often encourage students to do that. Watch English language TV and video with their own language subtitles. Why the hell not? Do translation activities. Maybe. Prepare tasks in their own language before switching to English. Especially perhaps at lower levels. You're setting them along a larger task. They're all going to have to, I don't know, decide who's the best candidate or whatever. Well, why not do some of the prep in your native language? Get some of the vocabulary. Figure out what you're going to need to say. If necessary, go to your dictionary. Think about it a little bit. When you then come into English, you're starting to use that information that you've gleaned. Research information in their own language and then feed back to the class in English. We had a closed group of Nepali teenagers who were a bit of a handful. They were ever so nice, but a bit of a handful a few months ago. And I set them a task where they had 15 minutes on their phones to research different topics and then produce a brief English language presentation. And when I said to them, research on your phones, but I want you to do it in Nepali. They went, you what? Yeah. Okay. And I'll tell you, the quality of the presentations I got was much, much better because they'd got much better information than they would get from an English language website. And they were much more interested in it, so they were much more engaged in trying to get it across. Use their own language to seek or offer clarification or scaffolding for tasks. We talk a lot, especially, and a lot of people talk a lot of garbage, quite frankly, about Vygotsky and scaffolding activities. But one of the most natural ways to scaffold an activity is in the learner's first language. If you get a stronger learner and a weaker learner, the stronger learner can scaffold the weaker learner using their native language. What Philip Kerr calls own language moments, little breaks. Sometimes the stress gets too much and you just need to kind of blow out in the native language. Or you just need to have, there's a thing that just needs to be talked about in the native language. Anyway, I'm going to give some practicals. Rather than, because I'm very conscious of time, if there are things you've done which actively require the use, please share them as we have some more wine and cheese. I'm going to give you some thoughts of my own and then wrap up. One of the things that the learner's own language can do is give us an information gap. Call my bluff. I think most people know that. You know, words, there's a word, you give 3 definitions, one of them is true. One of the problems in the English language classroom is you tend to have to use words which are really freakish and weird. Because if you have an elementary class and you do call my bluff and you do like dog, cat, milk, everybody in the class is going to know it. So you have to do things like hyperventilate or whatever, the troglodyte, that they're not going to know. They use a first language one, that's cool. I want you to give the words of 3 things in the bathroom. 3 things you'd find in the bathroom. And I want you to define them and explain what they are in your first... You give the word in your first language, then in English you explain what these things are, and the other team have to guess which is right. You're actually dealing with useful words, but there is still a genuine information gap. Reporting. I like to do reporting speech. If you've got a multilingual group particularly, get the 3 Korean speakers and the 3 Turkish speakers and the 3 Brazilian speakers and the 2 Italian speakers, and one of them has to give a little talk. I usually do something like, my first day in London or something like that. And they give a talk in their first language to the class. And it's usually things like McDonald's or Oxford Street. And then everybody gets together and they try to figure out what they were saying. And then finally, the group who share the language with the speaker say what they actually said. Reported speech, is a thing, which it isn't. But also that reported speech is a matter of this sort of word-for-word transliteration of language and transformation in a mechanical sense. It's not. It's just trying to get the gist across of what somebody else said. And when you're doing that between languages, that is an absolutely natural thing to do. When you do it within English, I'm not very happy anymore. She said she was not very happy anymore. Jigsaw readings, jigsaw listenings. One of the great things is Google Translate. Get a text, or get a series of texts, and translate them into all the languages of your class using Google Translate. Everybody gets their own language version. And then they put it together to try to build whatever the whole thing is. They're doing 2 things. They're doing the usual jigsaw reading thing, but they're also doing the translanguaging thing. And if you're worried about Google Translate, they will tell you if Google Translate has screwed up. They will tell you really quickly. There are things which are about mediation, about translanguaging. Multilingual dictogloss. Same kind of thing. Everybody gets the same text in their own language. Then groups that speak different languages get together and try to reconstruct it in English. Online research. Everybody goes away and researches a topic in their first language, then they get together in groups that speak different languages and produce a poster, a presentation, whatever. Go-between kind of activities. You've got 2 people. One of them speaks your native language, one of them doesn't. This person is the English user. You're the go-between. You have to try to help them get on. Translation correction. This was something that came about accidentally. Using Google Translate to do something slightly complex and giving it to people and saying, is that right? No, that's rubbish. It's just not. What's the original? Show me the... yeah. It's actually quite useful. Oops, come on. Scaffolding and supporting. Differentiation. It's a thing we go on about a lot in language classes these days, differentiating different levels of learner. Second language, for own language use gives you a way into that. You've got a weaker learner, give them some information in the native language. You're doing a text, put some words in the native language of one of the weaker learners. They've got something useful and important they can bring to the party without it being involving a huge amount of text comprehension that's way beyond them. Weak and strong pairs, the idea of a stronger person scaffolding a weaker one. Preparing tasks, we talked about that before. I think it can help learner independence. One of the things we say, and this is one of the things that lexical teachers of language have said forever, is when learners are learning idiom, an idiomatic kind of language, they need to not translate it, but think, what would I say in those circumstances? This is what an English person would say when somebody does. What would a Turkish speaker say? And when we start thinking like that between different language acts in different languages, we're beginning to get them to notice things about the 2 different languages and record them better. Self-directed reading and listening. One thing I love to do, it's a listening homework that you can give students. go to bed, and before you go to bed, listen to the news on the radio or on the TV, the main news headlines. Then and make some notes about what you think the main points of the story are. When you wake up in the morning, go online and look for a newspaper in your first language. Look for the same stories and see if you've got the right details. You can check your own listening, you can check your own reading. Reverse translation is something that's been done, Christ, for 400 or 500 years. The idea, these days I think most people agree that it's best to start in English, but you start with a text in English which learners have had some interaction with, they've probably done some comprehension work and whatever with. Then they go away and for homework they translate it into their native language. And then perhaps a day or two later, they bring those translations to the classroom and try to translate them back into English and then compare them with the original text. Works even better if you've got a group of 2 or 3 people who have translations into different languages. I've got a Brazilian translation, you've got an Italian translation, she's got a Polish translation, she's got a Japanese translation, and we're trying to build an English translation from that. These are some references, which I will leave there. Guy Cook's book, Translation in Language Teaching, 2010 was very good. Sheila Della, Mario Rinvolacri did Using the Mother Tongue. Guy Cook and Graham Hall have done a couple of quite nice little articles, research projects. That one comes from Language Teaching. And Philip Kerr's book, Translation and Own Language Activities, Oral